Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Aurelius Podcast. I'm Zach Naylor, co-founder and CEO here at Aurelius, and your host for the show. Our guest for this episode is Jorge Arango, an information architect, author, and designer. Jorge most recently authored the book Living in Information, which is about how physical architecture and places are both different and similar to the information spaces we live in today. Jorge and I talked about his book and a lot of the concepts within it. Jorge has a formal background in architecture, which was an inspiration for him in writing the book. I was sure to ask him some questions about the similarities and differences between physical architecture and the digital design work we do today. And while there's certainly parallels in process and concepts, there's a lot different between the two and so much we can learn from that. Very interesting stuff indeed. As a result of that conversation, we naturally went to the topic of design ethics. This is a big deal for Jorge and myself as well. Jorge shared some very important warnings and timeless wisdom for how to create more mindful and ethical design choices in your everyday work. We talked about how so much of the discussion and civic discourse we have is online, and that it's so important that the people building those digital spaces are using that power and responsibility with great care. And hey, I just want to mention really quickly that if you are a designer, researcher, or product leader looking for a way to store all of your user research, key insights, or nuggets, maybe to build a research repository or database, you should check out what we're doing with Aurelius. We help design and product teams add, tag, organize, and search all of their user research in one place to save time and effort in bringing their research insights into everyday decisions. You can check it out for a 14-day free trial over at our website, aureliuslab.com. That is www.aureliuslab.com. All right, let's get started with Jorge Arango. Welcome to Aurelius Podcast, episode 29 with Jorge Arango. He's an independent information architect and strategic designer. He's also an author of a few books, including most recently, Living in Information. Jorge, welcome to the show.
Hey, Zach, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. We're happy to have you here. I will have told folks a little bit prior to the intro to the episode about our conversation and a little bit of your background, but for those listening to the episode today, who maybe don't know about you and your work, can you give us a little bit of background of some things you've been working on and what you're passionate about?
Sure. So the thing to know about me is that my background is in architecture, as in the design of buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And I have nevertheless been doing what we now call user experience design in one form or another for the past 25 years or so. I left my career as an architect after about a year after graduation, I think much to the horror of my parents, because the web happened, and I saw the web and had a Saul falling off his horse on the road to Damascus moment. I somehow saw that this medium was going to change the world, and that I wanted to be a part of it. So I started basically a web design consultancy, which ended up being the first in my part of the world. I'm originally from Panama in Central America. And my first client was the first ISP in the country.
Oh, wow.
So it was an exciting time, and I have been doing it ever since. I started with telling you about my background in architecture because that has informed much of my career and the way that I approach the design of things like websites and apps and software in general.
Mm-hmm.
I bring an architectural lens to this practice.
That's really, really fascinating. I mean, many parts of your background, but that was something I did not actually know about you, Jorge, that you had a formal professional background in physical architecture.
Yes, that's right. When I was studying in university, which was in the late 80s, you couldn't really go. Well, there wasn't a web to begin with, and although we had obviously we had computer technology, but it wasn't as widespread as it is today, and there wasn't such a thing as UX, and there were no university programs teaching this sort of thing. I mean, there were a few programs teaching things like, pardon me, human-computer interaction, but interaction design in the sense that we understand it today was something that you couldn't go to school to study. I suspect that if something like that had been around, I would have gravitated towards that because I got into computers very early on. But in retrospect, going to architecture school was the perfect training for someone who does the sort of work that I do. Architecture is a design discipline first and foremost, but it's a design discipline that brings together a variety of different perspectives, and beyond things like aesthetics and engineering and human factors and history, and it just combines the whole of them into a very kind of systems oriented approach to making a place that works at various levels. It works in the level of inhabitation, and giving us a roof, giving us walls to protect us from the elements. That's like the most basic level, but it also works experientially. Like we design places to elicit particular effects and experiences, and that's something that we are doing today with software. And like I said, I think it's the perfect background for this sort of work.
Yeah, even just as you describe that and your background there and some of your applied experience, I can start to see the parallels between those, and I would love to dive into them. Even before we do, though, I'll just simply add something else I learned about Jorge as we were chatting before we started the episode is that he never swears. So in this episode, he's either going to keep me honest or I'm going to drag him down, and I hope I hope the better of the situation comes out.
I do swear, but I don't. Okay, so it's good that you bring this up, actually, because it's an opportunity for me to talk about the other passion, which is language. And language, in a way, what I do is I make architectures out of language. And the thing with swearing is that when you utter a swear word, you are using a very powerful construct to elicit an effect, right? You do it to, because you're pissed off, or you do it because you're surprised, or you do it because you want to achieve some kind of effect. And the thing with swearing is that if you do it all the time, it loses its potency. There are people who drop F-bombs casually in conversation, and it becomes kind of an affectation, a part of their personality. And that's perfectly fine. I don't pass judgment on that. But what it does is it essentially defangs those words. It makes it so that they lose their potency, because all of a sudden they're like a tick, and they're no longer, it's kind of like an incantation that has lost its power somehow.
Yeah, that I have a lot of respect for that, and that makes a ton of sense. In fact, I remember reading an article one time. This is very loosely related, but I think still very relevant, and particularly to your point, is that some folks in parenting and child rearing, they actually make it a point to swear, not casually but freely, around their growing children, where normally we would think that's a taboo thing. But the reason they do it is actually to teach that reverence. Is almost to teach exactly what you're suggesting is there's a time and a place for this to be used, and to learn that, rather than just learn it's no it's bad, but rather no, you can, and you're perfectly free to use it, but understand the right application. I think that's poignant.
Yeah, what was this in the Harry Potter books? There's all these spells, right? Expelliarmus or whatever. You don't want to be tossing those things around casually. they're powerful, and used well, they can move people.
I appreciate that very much. And in fact, Jorge, I think you would be a strong role model for me. Okay. So let's bring it back to, as we were talking about your background in architecture. This is fascinating. And I don't think this is the first time we've heard this, right? Like there are certainly other people like you who have a background in some physical architecture and certainly have moved into, IA and this more strategic type design. But if somebody were to ask you, what is the most directly applied thing, you learned and practiced in actual architecture that you use most frequently, say, today in what we might call UX design or this strategic design?
Sure. The most directly applicable thing is thinking at a different level of abstraction about the problem.
Mm.
So when you're designing a building, you don't start by drawing the facade or the plans or whatever. You have to first think about what that building is for, what it's going to do, and you have to figure out what kind of spaces are going to serve that program. And the way that architects do this is they start sketching out kind of abstract representations of the spaces that will compose the environment and the relationships between them. So that they can figure out things like relative sizes and relative locations, how people will move from one place to another, the relationship between those constructs and the context that they're going to be sitting in. For example, you may be dealing with a lot that has a very beautiful view in one direction, and that's going to influence the placement of certain functions within the building. So this idea that you start work at a higher level of abstraction, and then move progressively towards more tangible expressions, is something that is central to architecture, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly the aspect of it that's been the most influential to me. When I think about a UX problem, let's say, I'm thinking about what the parts of that environment are going to be and how people are going to move between one and the other, and how the set of those components creates a particular context that influences how they come to it and how they think about it.
Yeah. This is awesome. This is really, really awesome detail around this. And I love that you have this other background that's so relevant and applicable to the work that you're doing now, again, but also, many of us in this field. I think this is more of a curious question for me. Do you believe that those of us who do, UX design or strategic type design, would it go the other way? Would it apply, say, if I'm a great UX strategy person, would I also then be naturally inclined to be a good architect?
That's an interesting question. I think that when it comes to the actual manifestation of these things as tangible artifacts that we can interact with, you start getting into very specific constraints that you need to understand, which are specific to each field, right? The reason that I can make the transition from architecture to, or that I was able to make the transition from architecture to basically designing software relatively painlessly, is that I was actually designing software before I got into architecture, and I understood the constraints of that environment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the web was different than things like making games in BASIC and stuff like that, which is what I was doing before, as a kind of hobby when before going to university. But still, this principle that you're interacting with elements in a two-dimensional plane that is before you somehow, and you're doing it indirectly by manipulating some kind of control. That's a very different way of interacting with something than a building, which is an environment that you physically step into.
Yeah.
And buildings have all sorts of interesting physical constraints as well. You have to understand, for example, how different materials how different materials function at a very basic kind of physical level. Some materials work best in tension, some materials work best in compression, some materials are better for certain things than others. That understanding what the toolbox, what the palette is that is available to you is something that I think is specific to each field. So once you move away from abstraction and start talking about actual implementation and making things tangible and real, it becomes more kind of field specific. So I would think that making the transition from UX design to architecture would require, really grokking how the materials work and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, so all of this brings me to, we started by mentioning that you have a recently released book, Living in Information. And even as the title suggests, it sounds to me like you are drawing parallels there between actual physical spaces and the world of information we now almost viscerally live in.
Absolutely. Yeah. The gist of the book is that we have been interacting with each other. We're people are social animals, right? Like we're a social species, and we have been interacting with each other for a long time. And buildings and cities, designed built environments have been the context in which those interactions have happened for a long time. By the way, this is another thing that I love about architecture and that I try to bring to my work, this idea that there is a typology to a bank, for example. If you're going to be designing a bank, like talking about a physical bank, like a bank branch, you're not starting from scratch. There are templates because we've been building and using banks for a long time. There's a history of designing places to be banks. And as an architect, you can consult that history, and any intervention you make is going to stand in relation to that history, and it's going to either reject it or it's going to embrace it and extend it somehow. And we do the same when we're designing software. If you're designing an online banking system, we're not starting from scratch. There have been many online banking systems designed at this point. People are to a greater or lesser degree used to using things like this, and they bring expectations to that thing, right? So, anyways, that I feel like I'm doing a long parenthesis there, but the point of the book, the primary driving argument here is that these places that we have been interacting in as a species for a long time and which have served as our context are being I'll use the word supplanted because I think it is happening. They're being supplanted by a different type of environment. I'll give you a very concrete example.
Okay.
And it's an environment made of information. I'll say that. I'll give you a very concrete example. Before we started the interview and you were telling me about the conversation we were going to be having, you said, well, let's try to have a conversation that is like a conversation we would have if we met at a conference. And that is meeting in a physical place, like a conference or a bar or something like that, is the way that people have been meeting for most of our history. It's only been over the last 50, 60 years. When was the telegraph? It's only been,
I don't know.
right. So it's only been fairly recently for us that we've had other ways of meeting. And right now, you and I are talking in an environment that is at some level not real in the same way that a bar is real, right? Like you and I are not in the same room. We are not, I can't see you right now. Yet we are having a perfectly good and hopefully useful conversation. And we are, in a sense, inhabiting an environment that we have instantiated to allow this conversation to happen. Now, because we're using voice to do this, it feels a little trivial, and I say that because we've had the telephone for a long time, right?
Sure.
So it feels like it's not something new. But consider something like Wikipedia. So Wikipedia, I think most people think of Wikipedia as an encyclopedia, a publication, a sort of book, right? That just happens to be very, very big,
Sure. Makes
and
sense.
right, and that somehow changes very fast. And it certainly is that. I mean, it's an enormous book in a sense. If you try to print it out, it would be really, really big, and it would be out of date by the time the printer finished, right?
Right.
And there's actually someone who's done this. It's I believe it's cited in the book, if I recall correctly. But the interesting thing to me about Wikipedia is that beyond being this big encyclopedia, Wikipedia is also the place where that encyclopedia is written. You would not be able to get Wikipedia done by sitting a bunch of people together in an environment
Mm-hmm.
and having them kind of go at it with typewriters. It wouldn't happen. The economics wouldn't work. They would not be able to communicate efficiently enough. They would not be able to do their research well. They would not have the right environment to do that. So Wikipedia, beyond being a publication, Wikipedia is a place that allows Wikipedia to be written. It's a kind of environment, and it's been designed to enable a particular way of working, and it does work. I mean, there are problems with it. There people complain about certain biases and the mix of editors in it, and all those things are true. But it's also true that it's a remarkable thing that would not have been able to be produced otherwise.
Yeah. So this is fascinating, and the Wikipedia example you give, I think, is well, first of all, it's brilliant because it's very relatable. And I doubt that anybody listening here has not Googled or searched for something and come up with a Wikipedia article in which they accepted as relative fact or truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is curious because if I'm taking away uh, the high points of everything that you're saying, Jorge, is that Wikipedia, the creation of that place, basically allows for its own existence in many ways. So while you've said it certainly was designed that way, it almost sounds to me like you're suggesting there were many things about Wikipedia and how it has become that were never intentionally designed, but because the creation of the place, it enabled this exploration and this growth or evolution into something else that maybe we could not have anticipated.
Yeah, it's an example of what I call a generative environment, right? It's an environment that allows new things to emerge, including itself. Wikipedia keeps evolving, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know the details intimately because I have not in a long time. I haven't gone in and messed with it in the back end, but I know that they've evolved the infrastructure to manage things like pages that are frequently vandalized.
Okay.
So, for example, I think the page for the current president of the United States, whoever it is a page that is target to modification. I say whoever it is because I think that's been true for a while. I remember at least since the time of the second President Bush, seeing that the Wikipedia page for the president would have to go into lockdown because people would vandalize it, right? So my understanding is that initially it was more kind of free form and open-ended than it is today. Today there are certain pages that are marked as requiring different levels of editing in order to make changes to them because of this issue. So the point is, it's an environment that keeps evolving, and it keeps evolving in response to how people are using it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a system, and it's a system with feedback mechanisms, and it responds to what is happening in it. And it has processes to deal with change, which is very important because everything is constantly changing, and uh, you have to work with change. You have to make change your friend.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so this is interesting, and the first question that comes to my mind, and I'm asking out of my own curiosity, but also because I think other people would have this question, right? We're sitting here describing Wikipedia as this place that has feedback mechanisms that feed itself into evolving and changing into what it should be, or just simply the changes that will be. The question I have is, should all of our work be that? Should everything we create in this digital world, or now that we're living in information, as the title of your book suggests, should all places be that way?
Yes, some to a greater degree than others, right?
Okay,
So one of the differences between software and physical structures is that physical structures change much slower than software,
sure.
right? The example I always point to is when iOS 7 came out, the seventh version of the iPhone operating system. iOS 7 was a pretty major redesign of the front end of the operating system. It introduces kind of flat UI that we kind of take for granted now, but at the time it seemed very different. And that change happened literally overnight. And because iOS has such fast adoption rates, it changed how a lot of people interact with their devices, their mobile devices, which for many people is a primary, if not the primary device with which they interact with information. It changed it literally overnight, right?
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, you had this environment that where the underlying operating system looked one way, and a lot of the apps running on it looked a different way. And for a while there, it was a little bit of a mashup of different styles. But the point is that change happened very, very quickly. And we don't experience change that quickly in our buildings. I've been living here in Northern California now for almost 4 years. And there's a library near my house that I love to spend time in. That building has had a few minor changes in the last 4 years that I've been visiting it. They've changed the furniture mostly. And obviously, the books change a lot in it. But it certainly hasn't changed as radically and as quickly as iOS 7 changed.
Yeah. Uh,
So these things, so change is something that happens very, very fast and very frequently in software, much more frequently than in buildings. And we have to design for change. We have to design for uh, the the long term, basically.
Interesting. So is it that you're suggesting change is something we should embrace, but in a more gradual and measured fashion, as opposed to the iOS example you gave, where all of a sudden, um, you know, we flick the switch and it's a whole new world the next day.
Yeah, change is something that, to your point, we must embrace for sure. We must understand how environments change. They don't all change at the same. They don't change at the same speed or pace. There's a concept that comes from the world of architecture, but was popularized by Stuart Brand. Um, this idea of pace layers, where some aspects he originally wrote about it in the context of architecture. He said that buildings are composed of elements that change at different rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the site the building is built upon changes much more slowly than things like the furniture that is in the building, right? and
Yeah.
and I think that that's something that we understand. And if you're going to make an intervention in a building, you would be better served by altering the parts of the building that can change faster. So you don't mess around with the structure because the building might collapse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to be conscious about those layers and how they change. And we who are designing experiences, especially software-based experiences, are also dealing with environments that change at different rates, that are composed of things that change at different rates. When iOS 7 launched, that change was a change to the user interface of the operating system. And sure, there were some changes also to how you interact with it, but primarily it was the thing that was so shocking about it was a kind of change to the formal layer of that environment. Structurally, iOS 7 was very similar to preceding operating systems, iOS operating systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
You still have this concept of apps that live in a home screen. You still tapped on them to enter the space of an app. Those things didn't change about it, right? So the change that we experienced there was kind of a cosmetic change. And one of the things that I'm saying in this book is I'm trying to make a mapping between the pace layers, how they change in architecture, to the work that we're doing, and saying, let's embrace this idea that the cosmetic aspects of the environment can change more quickly than the structural aspects. And then let's be more thoughtful about what we're doing structurally, because these things tend to stick around longer.
Okay, we're getting into some pretty good stuff now. Just to reiterate what you said, embrace the fact that the cosmetics or visual or aesthetic layer of the things we work on can and perhaps should change more frequently, but being mindful of when and if we make suggestions to change things structurally in our products, meaning the underlying technology, the way information is perhaps organized and even served up.
Yeah, the way that you have um, divided up your environment. So whenever again, let's go back to thinking about buildings. So I am speaking to you from a little home office that I have in my house, right? I have set aside this space to do my work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the same space as our living room or our kitchen. Those are different environments in my home. And we have very consciously created distinctions between these environments so that we can use them for their purposes, right?
Right.
So my home office is a quiet space. It's kind of in the back of the house, facing away from the street. I have my working tools laid out around me, right? So this is in distinction to our living room or our bedroom, which have different purposes. Whenever you design an information environment, and an information environment, I'm referring to things like the Wikipedia or the Aurelius app, the system that you all have designed, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These are environments. And for people to be able to use them, we have to create distinctions between different parts of the environment where people are going to do different things and in a very similar way that they do in buildings. The way that we create distinctions in these software-based experiences, though, is through language, which is why I was saying that that's another one of my passions, right? This idea that when you have a navigation bar, for example, that tells you, that's like a guide to the different subdivisions of that environment, the places within that environment where you can go to do different things. And when designed thoughtfully, these parts of the environment all function together to help you achieve your goals.
Sure. Okay. So I mean, yeah, these are different pages of our app. These are different rooms of our house, and this is for those of us who've been around for a while and maybe have a gray hair or two. We've all used this analogy, right? Like,
Yep.
Architecture and interaction design is drawing the blueprints of the house before we decide, what color tile we're going to put in the bathroom, sort of thing.
Yeah, and think about the language that we've used, right? And it's weird because it is a new thing, right? And whenever we are faced with a new thing, we struggle and we try to do the best we can to talk about it, right? But the early days, we talked about having a home page, right?
Yeah.
which is, if you think about that phrase home page, that's a weird thing. It's mixing two metaphors. On the one hand, there's a spatial metaphor, home, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's a publication metaphor. It's a page somehow. So it's kind of acknowledging that there's this weird thing we're dealing with it, which is kind of spatial, but it's also kind of like a publication because it's made up mostly of text and images.
Yeah.
So our language kind of reveals that we have been thinking about these things spatially. We talk about, for example, we have a back button in our browsers, which lets us go back, and we talk about navigation, right? Like we experience these things as somehow going from one part of the environment to another. And I don't think the analogy is perfect. It breaks down in many ways, but I do think that there's something there if we've kind of instinctively gravitated towards using spatial language when talking about them.
Yeah. Well, this is a very fascinating exploration into the intricacy of the language you use that has just been adopted as canon, right, for the work that we do. In those two things that you mentioned, like homepage and navigation. So those things combined for me is to suggest, well, we are suggesting there is a home spot and that you are to navigate to somewhere else. Well, so then again, if we're gonna actually examine the language there, that means what? Like you need a map, you need an indication of the right place to go. You need to know a destination from home, right? Like that's just a very interesting and fascinating several steps deeper to think about this.
And many of the larger information environments that we deal with have site maps, right? And we come to expect that, right? Precisely because of what you're saying. It's like we need orientation. We need to know what distinctions this environment creates and where I can go to do different things. If I'm in a bank's website, I have this expectation, again, history, right? I have this expectation now after so many years of using bank websites that if I open an account with a new bank and I go online to their information environment, I will have at least two distinctions. There will be a part of the environment where I can read about the bank's products and services and the things they can do for me. And there will be a part of the environment where I can log in and view my stuff, my accounts, right? Like there's a public and a private part of that environment. And that's an expectation I bring to it. And I think that you'd be hard pressed to launch a new bank with an information environment that didn't accommodate that basic distinction.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, we have to become more conscious about the placemaking aspect of these things that we're doing, the context that we're creating when we do these things. Because if I'm in the public part of the bank's website and I know that, I am going to be less willing to do something like give you personal information about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'd be willing and I would probably even need to do that in the private part of the environment. And it'd be very important for me to know which part of the environment I'm in, right? Like these things create contexts that where we expect we can do different things.
Yeah. So Jorge, this is a very interesting in sort of philosophical chat, which I appreciate very, very much. And so I'm gonna continue that trend here a moment and ask you a question. Is it a situation that we find ourselves in? Again, as your book title suggests, living in information, where there are now enough set expectations of common information spaces that we simply shouldn't break the rules on, but also that suggests that in time, something else will come and begin to set new expectations for completely different spaces that we don't have perhaps a physical parallel to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. My sense is that we have less baggage than architecture does, so we have more room for exploration. Yes, we do have to. Anything we do, especially if it's working within a well-trodden space like financial services, anything we do is going to sit in relation to what has come before. We can launch a bank that has, for example, no public-facing no public facing site. But people are going to think about it when they come to it because they've experienced other banks, and most of them do, right? So
Sure.
we have to be cognizant of the fact that whatever our intervention is, it's going to stand in relation to what's come before it.
Yeah.
But I would like to say something here because you talked about this as an interesting philosophical exploration, which it is. I do think that it's a philosophical exploration, but it has very real consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And you asked earlier about why I wrote the book. And the reason I felt compelled to write the book is that we are in the process of moving more and more of our social interactions to these information environments. And in many cases, we're doing it kind of unwittingly. And quite frankly, we're at great risk of messing up the world.
Wow.
And that sounds alarmist, but I think that you need only look at what's happened to our civic discourse over the past, I would say, 10 years
Mm-hmm.
to realize that that things are not all right with what is happening. And I attribute that in great part to the fact that we have moved very important conversations, frankly, a lot of our civic discourse, to environments that have not been designed to accommodate that sort of interaction. They've been designed to basically engage us so that they can show us advertising and persuade us to buy things.
Mm-hmm.
And I have nothing per se against advertising. I think that advertising is useful when used in the right contexts. And we can talk about what those are, at least from my perspective. But I think that it's very difficult to have a transparent conversation with someone if the environment is designed to keep you there and to keep you engaged. I think that that's a very different interaction than what that happens in an environment that is, let's say, more neutral, or that has a business model that is more closely aligned with the objectives of the people who are going to be using the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. No question. And I think, what you're bringing up with this point too, just not to oversimplify it, is an ethical issue, right?
Absolutely.
In the power we wield with the tools and resources and capabilities that we are often here to mold as designers and product makers. And I very much appreciate you bringing up this fact as a point of conversation. So the thing I would ask you, Jorge, is how can we be more mindful about this? How can we make better decisions so that we are bringing this back to a place that makes more sense, and actually promotes a stronger society as opposed to perhaps driving us apart or degrading our society in civil discourse.
Yeah, I think that we need to be very, very mindful of the information environments that we are participating in. And this is a trend that I think is starting to become more prevalent and will become more prevalent over time. This idea that, for example, the major mobile operating system vendors are now starting to build tools into the operating systems that allow you to track the usage of your apps and how much time you're spending in them. Because many of these environments, as I was saying, have been designed to keep you engaged, and we kind of lose ourselves. They're tapping into deep, uh, very deep behavioral quirks of human beings to keep us there, right?
Yeah.
And we have to start becoming more mindful of that, of the way that we're using these things, how participating in discussions or visiting these environments is affecting us um, emotionally and intellectually. And also, I think that we have to become more literate as to how these things are making money, right? Like this idea that if you are not paying for it, then you're the product. I think that a lot of people assume that that means that your information is being sold. And that's a part of it. Your information is being sold. But that's not the expensive stuff. The expensive stuff is your attention.
Yes.
You are going to, you and I, it's not just you, this is true of me as well and of everyone listening here. We basically have a clock that's ticking, and eventually this consciousness that is allowing us to have this conversation is going to be no more. So our time is limited, and we have to become much more aware of where we are focusing our attention, and for what ends. That's not going to be easy because we are, like I said, we are moving more and more of our interactions to environments that make it very, very fun and very pleasant to, or not just fun and pleasant. They also piss us off, right? Like, and that's by design. And because pissing off is a way of keeping you engaged, right? So this idea that they're somehow monopolizing your attention, we have to become much, much better stewards of our attention. And that's why this book exists. I'm hoping to help give folks a lens through which to look at the things that they're interacting with, to hopefully help them be more mindful about what we're doing, when we're using these things, and especially for the folks who design them. We have to start becoming much more ethical, and by ethics, ethics is a deep and gnarly subject. But I think that we have to start. I'll say it in what is probably more concrete terms. We have to start becoming a lot smarter about understanding the things that we are enabling, the business models that we are making possible through the things that we design, and starting to not just understand them, but also take a stand on whether you want to be a part of enabling those things, or whether you want to be a part of helping people be more mindful of the way that they interact, and make them, help them be better parents, better citizens, better coworkers, rather than just folks who you're trying to persuade somehow.
Right. That's this is a huge point that I think you just made there, Jorge. And so this makes me wonder. I have a question, and I guess perhaps a comment. The comment I have is, understanding is the first step to then being able to take an effective stand, I believe, right? My question to you is, do you believe that this has been an intentional creation, right, by design, world of information that we now find ourselves in, that is essentially sapping human attention, right, for profit and gain? Or do you think that this is something we sort of stumbled in by accident, because interestingly enough, as humans, we kept giving ourselves the things that we wanted by taking from others their attention, right, by giving them the things that they wanted.
I don't like to think in terms of folks who. A lot of people try to present this subject as though it's a matter of bad actors trying to exploit folks.
Right.
I don't think that. I don't think that we maliciously got into the situation we're in.
That was the exact word I was thinking that escaped me. So thank you for using that. Malicious.
Sure thing. I think that what happened, and Jaron Lanier has written very compellingly about this, by the way, and he's someone whose books your audience should check out if they're interested in this stuff. But basically, early on in the web, we made the choice to fund this sort of work through advertising. There was this idea that what you wanted to do was get to grow as quickly as possible, and to lower barriers to entry, which meant basically not having people pay for things, and instead showing them ads. And this is a model that comes from, obviously it's not new to the web, it's been around for a long time. Um, there's a great book by Tim Wu called The Attention Merchants that traces the history of advertising. But early on in the history of the web, we made this choice to go down this path of having this be the preeminent business model, and I think that was the issue, right? Like the fact that we now have these enormous companies, which a lot of them are now public, and therefore have legal duties to their shareholders to keep generating revenue. So they're incentivized to keep that going, right? And it's very hard when you're growing. Let's say Facebook, for example, which I think is the biggest one, right? Uh, Facebook has to somehow keep growing. Just yesterday, they announced quarterly results and had something like their stock price dropped like 20% or something.
Mm-hmm.
Overnight, right? Because they're no longer growing at the rate that they used to be growing. And they're not growing in part because they are trying to take steps to ameliorate this problem. So there's a great deal of pressure, and the incentives are all set against doing the right thing here, you know? And it's not that anyone kind of maliciously designed it that way. It's that we made this kind of devil's bargain to make things quote unquote free by basing it on this business model. Now, like I said earlier, I don't want to sound like I'm shooting down all of advertising. I think that some environments are a better fit for advertising than others. And the preeminent example for me is Google. Google is not a place that I go to hang out. Google is a place that I go to find things and leave.
Mm-hmm.
And if the thing that is being advertised to me is what I'm looking for, they've done me a service, right? It's not designed to keep me there. It's designed to get me to go to places, and therefore that is better aligned with my needs, my expectations, my the value that I derive from the environment, right? So I don't think it's a black and white thing. I don't think that advertising is all bad. I just think that we've applied it much too broadly to too many things, and it's especially pernicious when the things that we're trying to do in the environment is inform ourselves, interact with our fellow citizens, right? Then we get into real trouble, because the environment, an environment that is designed to keep you there, is going to start doing all sorts of things that that will influence that. For example, and this is not in any way news to anyone, I think, but this idea that it creates filter bubbles or opinion bubbles, where all of a sudden all the things you see are from people who hold your same perspective,
Right.
or a very similar perspective. That's by design to keep you engaged, right? Like that does not promote any kind of social wheel. You know, it's pernicious. It polarizes people, right? And it's a matter of how the environment where the conversations is happening, where the conversations are happening, how it's been designed and towards what ends, right?
Right. Well, if the engine that drives the growth and success of that thing is, again, I'm stealing some of your language in the description of your book, open to the highest bidder, that inherently means we are promoting and accepting behavior that you can buy the attention of people. And this is a very, very prickly problem we're dealing with, because I actually share your opinion. I don't think advertising is inherently bad, right? A lot of people like to believe they don't like to be advertised or marketed to, but the reality of it is some of the best things in their life, perhaps some of the things they may even hold most dear, would have never come to their attention had it not been for those activities, right?
Right.
So I don't think it's inherently bad, but I could not agree more with the way you're describing this. And again, this as somebody like John Coco might put, a wicked problem.
Yeah.
It's a global societal problem, like you said, where it's creating these echo chambers. That's only the machine is feeding you the things that you have expressed you want to see and hear. So it's not actually progressing you as an individual or us as a society, and it's all simply because we're accepting the profit for that behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It is a wicked problem, and we have to grow up basically and accept responsibility as designers for the fact that the things that we are dealing with are complex, and we are creating very we are making interventions that have nuances and complexity, right? And we have to figure out how we're going to do it. There's a line in one of the Star Wars movies, in one of the prequels, which I don't know if you,
it's dangerous territory, Jorge.
I know. And here we thought I wasn't gonna swear, right? But
if there's anything that's going to cause Jorge to swear, it's the prequel movies of Star Wars.
No, but there's a line there that frequently comes to mind, right? And it's I think it's uttered by Obi-Wan Kenobi. He says, "Only a Sith thinks in absolutes." I think is the phrase, right? Like we have to struggle, because it is a struggle, because everything around us is pushing us in the opposite direction. But we have to struggle to understand that things are not black and white. Things are not yes or no. There are levels of gray. There are nuances to things, and understand that the environments that we are designing need to accommodate for those.
Yeah.
And the issue, or one of the issues I have with the advertising business model when dealing with things like civic discussions, is that what we want as a society, what we want as a people who have some kind of shared goal, and the shared goal can be as simple as we got to live together because we're neighbors, right? We have to occupy the same space. If we are to function as a people, we have to find ways of seeing past our differences so that we can work together, so that we can somehow come to middle ground. We're not going to be perfectly aligned, but we have to find ways of coming to middle ground, and that requires that we start looking for the things that we share in common, right? The things that make us similar. And my concern with advertising as a model for these things is that advertising is pushing us in the opposite direction. It's looking to slice us up into ever narrower demographics, so that it can because I'm a more valuable audience. The more precise you can narrow me down.
Exactly. You're more valuable the more absolute you can be. The more you take a side and choose black or white.
And if you can keep me there, right? Like if you polarize me and get me really pissed off, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in your environment, because that's where I'm going to get the hit of reinforcement that I need to all of a sudden like construct this worldview, right?
Exactly.
I think that's pernicious, and I think it's leading us down a very dangerous path. And we as designers have a role in helping correct for this, I think.
I would agree with you. I will go so far as to say I don't think, I know. I have such a great appreciation for the fact of you calling it out, these shades of gray that we live in, and you have nailed it with describing the world that we live in right now. This is, everybody believes that you have to choose a side, almost in anything that we have. And I've actually had conversations very recently with people most near and dear to me, where I've described this as, it's like watching sports teams. You love your sports team, whether they suck, whether they're terrible people, right? Whether they've won the world championship of whatever it is, and you fight for them and you defend for them. And you can't really say why. You don't get anything out of it personally, but there's something inherently that has given you a sense of pride or a sense of place or meaning that you have to fight for that. And the reality of it is, when you apply that to, as you've said, Jorge, like civic discourse and living in the same space as other people, the world does not work that way. There are too many shades of gray. People do not operate under the conditions of black and white. It doesn't happen. And those that do, they're too polarized. And traditionally, in history, because we were talking about that, have been ostracized as too extreme, one way or the other, right?
Yep. And now we're reinforcing that, and we're incentivizing for it, right?
Exactly
That's
right.
and that's the challenge. The sports team thing is a perfect. I think it's a perfect analogy because sports is zero sum, right? Like when you're backing a team, you want your team to win. For
Hmm.
your team to win, the other team must lose, right? Like
Exactly.
that's the whole point. There's a book I love called Finite and Infinite Games by James Cars. Another one worth checking out if any of the stuff we're talking about interests you. But Cars opens his book by making a distinction between what he calls finite and infinite games, and he says, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but he says, finite games are games that we play with the object of winning,
Hmm.
and infinite games are games we play with the object of keeping the game going.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that we have to, this is not an option, we have to transcend this zero sum thinking, because ultimately what we're doing is we are playing a game, but it's not a game about beating those other people. It's a game about how can we keep going. I have kids. I want my kids to have kids, and I want their kids to have kids, and I want them all to be happy, healthy people.
Hmm.
And that requires that we acknowledge that there is a long-term incentive for us to make things better, and we need to come to an understanding of how to work together. This zero-sum thinking literally is going to kill us. So we need to transcend this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is a huge point for anybody who's listening and has definitely made it this far towards the end of our episode. Take note of what we're discussing here. This is a big deal. This game of life and this thing we're doing in design to support people's lives, because that's exactly what we're doing. This is not a win or lose thing. This is an infinite game. This is a how do we all do this together better game. I,
Right.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate that point you've just made, Jorge. And on that note, I have to be the unfortunate caller of the time, for whom the bell tolls here. That we're coming up on our time with you. I am quite sure we can spend several more hours discussing these points. But unfortunately, we don't have the time, and I want to be respectful of that for you. So
The bar's closing, right?
the bar is closing. Exactly. And that is a zero sum game. We either make that or we don't.
That's right.
So I'm just kind of curious, if let's say I had a case of temporary amnesia and I forgot everything we discussed here today. What's the one salient point, the one big takeaway you think folks should have of everything we discussed?
Think about how much time you're spending interacting with other people and with organizations through software in information environments,
Mm-hmm.
and be mindful of why you're doing it and who's benefiting from you doing it, and in what ways. And if you're a designer, know that you can influence that and make the world better through your work. You don't have to despair at how things are. You have to just make things better. And there are ways of doing it. And I've written a book that hopefully can help you do that. It's called Living in Information. And you can find it at livingininformation.com. And I would love to hear what you think about it. And I'll probably hear what you think about it through information environments, because that's how we communicate today.
Nice way to tie that off there, Jorge. Word up to that for sure. Take it to the bank. Think about what you're doing. You can have a positive impact. Choose to have a positive impact. Jorge, is there anything else you want to share with folks listening today that we haven't discussed?
No, just to say that it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm just hoping that everyone who listens to this, moves towards becoming more conscious and more aware of who they are and what they're doing. And wishing you all the best.
I love it. If we can all be 1% better tomorrow, imagine the impact that would have on the world.
Absolutely.
I love it. All right, everybody. Jorge, thank you very much for taking the time. This has been a wonderful chat.
Thank you, Zach. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, everybody. We will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving us a rating on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen to our podcast. And also, you can fill out our podcast survey, where you can let us know if someone awesome that we should have on the show, and even tell us about the things you would want to hear about, topics that are interesting for you. You can check that out in the show notes or on our website. Thanks for listening to the Aurelius Podcast, the show where we talk with brilliant minds about user research, UX design, and building great products that meet the needs of real people and what you learned about them. Aurelius is a user research and insights tool for design and product teams. Aurelius helps you add, tag, organize, search, and share all of your user research notes and customer feedback insights to figure out what you learned faster and easier than ever before, so you can make awesome designs, products, and features. Check us out for a free trial at aureliuslab.com. That is AURELIUSLAB.com. Or find us on Twitter at Aurelius. We'll see you next time.